physical aspects unto it, but the battle is a spiritual battle. And we are continually called and challenged to be men and women of courage in the midst of that spiritual warfare. Now, I would submit unto you that the vast majority of folks who are in the Church of Jesus Christ in the United States of America probably have no concept of a spiritual battle and no understanding of their role within this spiritual warfare that's taking place. And for most folks, they don't see their service unto Christ as anything involved in being a good soldier of Jesus Christ. They see it quite contrary unto that. But we've been called to be good soldiers unto Christ. And in this passage, Daniel exposes to us some young men of courage and character. They exemplify what godly courage is all about. Now, I want to say this. These young men, they lived in tough times. They lived in difficult circumstances. I know oftentimes we look at our circumstances, we look at the times that we live in and our own personal surroundings, and we think, boy, nobody's ever had it like I have it. They've never had it as tough as I've had it. Well, quite honestly, the times they were living in were a whole lot more difficult than what we see. Their country had been conquered by the Babylonians. And these young men, they were removed from their country. They were taken away from their families. They were removed from their familiar surroundings, and they were taken under the nation of Babylon. In those days, there were no travel guides. And so they had no concept, no understanding of what Babylon would really be like. All they knew is the people of Babylon who had come and invaded them. And now they find themselves in a foreign land. They're forced to embrace a foreign culture, and they are being retrained into the Babylonian culture, into the Babylonian mindset. They're involved in an intensive reprogramming of their minds. The mindset Nebuchadnezzar had was, if you can capture the minds of the youth, you can control the country. And so he's seeking to reprogram and re-navigate the minds of these young people, that he can send them back and control the nation of Israel, that there'll not be any uprisings or any insurrections, and that they'll be at peace and they'll follow the Babylonian way. The one thing that Nebuchadnezzar didn't take into account was that for most of these Babylonian young people, and for these three specific ones you find in chapter 3, and Daniel that you find in chapter 1, that this isn't just a cultural thing unto them. These individuals have a real relationship with God. And quite honestly, if all it had been about was culture, they would have folded a long time before. But it's about their service unto God. It's not about their own country. It's not about their own culture. It's about their service unto God. The problem I think we have today is there are a lot of folks that are battling for culture and not battling for Christ. And quite honestly, you see that taking place within the church. How many times have you heard folks say, boy, I wish it was like the good old days? And we want to go back to a specific time, a specific cultural aspect that we had, and maybe some good days the church enjoyed, but those days are long gone. And that's not really what Christ came to establish. It wasn't a culture, it was a kingdom, a spiritual kingdom in the hearts of his people. And ultimately, Christ was desiring to build his kingdom in the hearts of mankind upon this earth. So we're not called to engage in a cultural conflict. We're called to engage in a spiritual battle. And I would submit unto you, it is difficult, certainly in our day, but it was difficult in their day. I want you to think about this. As you read through chapter 1, you find that Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael, and Daniel, they're not the only young people that have been taken from Israel and relocated unto Babylon. Matter of fact, there are quite a number of young people that have been brought into Babylon, this Babylonian reprogramming aspect. Look back in chapter 1, and I want you to look in verse 3. Daniel chapter 1, and look in verse 3. It says, And the king spake unto Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel, and of the king's seed, and of the princes, children in whom was no blemish, but well favored, and skillful in all wisdom, and cunning in knowledge and understanding science, and such as had ability in them to stand in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans. And the king appointed them a daily provision of the king's meat and of the wine which he drank, so nourishing them 3 years, that at the end thereof they might stand before the king. Now among these were of the children of Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. You find that there's a number of young people, some probably from other countries as well, that have been involved in this intensive delving into the Chaldean culture, retraining them and reprogramming them, and numbers of them are involved in that. So they're not the only ones involved in this. But here's what you find. The vast majority that were involved in this, they caved under the pressure that was placed upon them. They gave in to the pressure that was around them. They didn't fight a good fight. They didn't endure hardness as a good soldier. But Hananiah, Azariah, Mishael, they were young men of courage and young men of commitment. By the way, they weren't just idealists. It is interesting, the ideals that people have and the things that they say, maybe not realizing what cost is really involved in living out those ideals. Amen? You with me? I mean, I've heard a lot of things in recent days about insurrection and rebellion. And I'm not sure folks are really willing to invest in what that really requires. Because it's one thing to be an idealist and say something, it's something entirely different to put your money where your mouth is. So these aren't just idealists that spout something off from their mouth. They actually live what they say they believe. Their commitment is put to the test. And in chapter 1, you find that they refuse the benefits that their compromise under the Chaldean culture would bring unto them. They could have had the finest of the finest. They could have had the king's meat. They could have enjoyed all sorts of luxuries at the hands of Nebuchadnezzar, but they refused it in order that they might not be indoctrinated into that mindset and that mentality, that they might not embrace that culture around them. In chapter 3, they embraced the persecution that their courage by standing against Nebuchadnezzar would yield unto them. And so they turned down the benefits that could have been theirs if they just toe the line. And then on the flip side, by not towing the line, they embrace the persecution that comes their way because they stood for the Lord. Now I want you to see this. As you read through the book of Daniel, and as you read through the history that culminates around Daniel, you find the conformists, they made no impact for God upon Nebuchadnezzar at all. None whatsoever. Those folks who said, hey, listen, you might be bowing on the outside, but you're standing on the inside. Just do what they say. Go on. Those conformists made no impact at all upon Nebuchadnezzar. Matter of fact, the conformists also did nothing to benefit the people of God, the nation of God, or the name of God. They only benefited themselves. And by the way, the benefit they received was minimal and short-lived at best. You guys still with me out there? But the courageous few, they made a tremendous impact upon Nebuchadnezzar. Matter of fact, they laid the foundation that God was able to build upon in bringing Nebuchadnezzar to an understanding of who God was, and ultimately a benefit of the people of God and the name of God down the road. So the question naturally emerges, how were these young men able to face the flames when so many others didn't and so many others wouldn't? How were they able to stand up in the midst of intense persecution, in the midst of intense conformity that pressed upon them? How were they able to face the flames and stand when others could not? Let me give you 3 thoughts. Number one. First of all, they were different. They were different. Well, that's deep, isn't it? They were different. Nebuchadnezzar makes an image of gold, is what you find taking place in chapter 3. He is making this image to celebrate his gods, but really it runs deeper than that. Nebuchadnezzar's establishing this idol that he might have some sense of deity himself. It's really not about just worshiping this image. It's also about worshiping Nebuchadnezzar and the ways of Babylon as well. The image itself is huge. It's 90 feet tall. And not only that, it's 9 feet around or 9 feet circumference. It towers over everything. He has this image erected. It stands up in the plain of Dura. And it would have been a large, flat expanse of land where numbers of people could gather together. You could see it from a long ways off, and people could gather around it and celebrate and just worship this idol that ultimately represents Nebuchadnezzar. And the instruction they're given is this: when the music plays, everyone is to bow down and worship this golden image that Nebuchadnezzar has had constructed and erected on the plain of Dura. And if you bow, you do fine. But if you don't bow, you die. By the way, it is true, they said if you don't bow, you die. But can I submit unto you that if you do bow, you die as well? You just die a little bit slower. And it's just a little bit more shameful, the death that you face by bowing unto the image of Nebuchadnezzar. And I would submit there had to be some rationalizations that tried to wedge into the minds of those young men. Try to put yourself in their place. Because if you go back into chapter 1, you find that they've made a name for themselves, especially in chapter 2. In chapter 1, they distinguish themselves because they're not going to take anything from the king, and they tell the eunuch who's watching over them, listen, just give us a little bit of time. Give us 10 days. And at the end of that time, if we're not doing better than these other folks, then we'll take the king's pulse. We'll take the king's meat. We'll take what the king has given. Well, they prove to be doing well, and so the eunuch allows them to continue to reject those things that came from the king. In chapter 2, after Daniel interprets a dream, you find that they really begin to escalate and elevate. Because in the latter part of chapter 2, in verse 49, it says, "Then Daniel requested of the king, and he set Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon. But Daniel sat in the gate of the king." By the way, the fact that they had elevated to such a high position within the government was one of the reasons those folks went after them in chapter 3 and took note of the fact that they didn't bow under the golden idol. And so it would have been easy for them to rationalize in their mind and think, well, you know what, we're just captives, and we've been brought into this Babylon, and we had nothing when we came, and God's blessed us, and we've been elevated, and we're lifted up into these positions, and maybe they would have thought about their position. We have the king's ear, and we're able to accomplish some things for God. Look where he's positioned us and placed us, and if we get ourselves killed over some silly little thing about not bowing unto a golden idol, we're of no use to anyone. And it had been easy for them to rationalize and reason. By the way, the church has gotten really good at rationalizing and reasoning in the days we live in, haven't we? Maybe they would have thought about their peers. And when it came time to bow, when the music played and people began to drop before that golden idol and they began to look around the way that folks do, maybe they noticed that, hey, nobody else is standing. All those other young men from Israel, they're not standing. They've fallen. Everybody else is bowed, and you know, what's it going to hurt if we bow as well? I mean, everybody else is doing it. What's the big deal? And again, we may be bowing on the outside, but we're standing internally. It may just be an external conformity, but we haven't conformed on the inside. And by the way, every time I read through the book of Daniel, when I read chapter 3, my question is always the same. Where is Daniel in chapter 3? Where is he? I mean, I know at least I think I know, that there's no way Daniel is going to bow to that golden image. I mean, he wouldn't even stop praying towards Jerusalem when the decree had been given by the king in chapter 6. He ends up in a lion's den because of his commitment unto God. There's no way that Daniel is bowing. But where is he? Where is Daniel? Jimmy, that's your assignment, to find out where Daniel is in Daniel chapter 3. I mean, it'd be easy to say, well, you know what? It's not a big deal to everybody else. And I'm not, I don't know what went through their minds in terms of temptation. I don't know if they were worried about their position. I don't know if they thought about their peers. I don't know if the thought of self-preservation crossed their own mind. I don't know that. But I do know this. I do know they were willing to be different. In spite of what everybody else did, in spite of what was going on around them, they were willing to be different at that moment in time, at that moment of history. Regardless of what everybody else did, if the whole world went wrong, they determined they were going to stay right. And I'm telling you, the older I get, the more convinced I am that persecution draws closer and closer and closer unto the church. And you and I better purpose and determine, if the whole world goes wrong, I am still going